But here you mentioned the number of some of the public commissions that he's done that have involved architecture. The Boston panels is one, the Dartmouth panels more recently in 2011. And then we have Austin here, a beautiful twilight rendering of the building. And this, I would love to talk about this in our remaining time, and then we'll turn it over for questions. But a little bit of history about Austin, and I'll have our panelists chime in here as well. But it was first designed he had the idea in 1986 for a collector in the LA area, in Santa Barbara area, and it was this idea for a building filled with stained glass windows, and he'd never worked in stained glass before. This is going to be the first time, not only that he's ever designed a building, but also that he's ever worked in the medium of colored glass. And for an artist who's all about color and light, I think this is an incredibly exciting challenge for him. But he first created this for, it was going to be for a private collector in Santa Barbara, and but he realized that it didn't really make sense for this to be on private grounds, because what was going to happen when the collector moved, and it really needed to have the custodianship of a museum or a public space that also so that it could be accessible to a much wider audience. And so fast forward, he had done conceptual designs, but he really hadn't gotten beyond that. It was basically kind of in a drawer. He had a model at the studio, or then in his archives, and he had this idea sort of sitting around in a drawer for a very long time, because he wisely thought he shouldn't do it there. And the project came to us from Hiram Butler, who's in the audience here somewhere. Yes, there you are. A wonderful UT alum and gallerist in Houston, and he brought the project forward to the university and talked to me and Simone about doing this, and we realized that this was sort of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to realize something great. And I don't mean to speak for Jack and Ellsworth, but my sense is that this was also the right fit because we could be, as a museum, we can care for the structure. We can be a center for research. We already have, amazing faculty who've worked on Kelly's work. We can be a center for research for his work, and it's going to be part of the museum's permanent collection.
And it's sunny here. That's
and it's sunny here.
That's important.
I forgot to put that in the official history of the project.
Light.
No, you're right, though. The Texas light is going to be incredibly important. And this tumbling, what we've been affectionately referring to as the tumbling squares window, this is facing east. So I'm sorry, we're in a dark auditorium, so it's hard to think about where this is situated. But this will be very close, obviously a separate building, but very close to the Blanton's grounds. And this is a model. This is a rendering of the inside. So there will be 3 monumental stained glass windows that Ellsworth has designed, and yellow is always in his spectrum of color. Yellow is always the first and the last, and I love that it's high yellow here. Begins with yellow. And what you're seeing inside are black and white marble panels that you guys all mentioned. There are 14 of them, and the light streaming through. The building is about, it's an intimate building. It's not a huge building. This is not about a grandiose gesture. This is going to be, I think, a really beautiful, intimate space. It's about 2,715 or so square feet, and it will be a stone exterior, sort of very soft limestone, and then white painted walls. But Carter, you wrote pretty much the only essay until the Fiden book came out, which includes this image actually. You really had written the only essay about this project. I'd love if you could share some of that history and its connections to earlier art with us.
Right. Well, so of course the chapel itself is a very simple form. It's a barrel. It's 2 intersecting barrel vaults. It's sort of what I guess we call a Greek cross plan, but it takes inspiration from Romanesque architecture, which Ellsworth loves deeply and experienced firsthand in France. So it's an expression of that in a distilled modern form, as he does. He distills down, and then and I know it's important too that this is not a denominational chapel. It's not denominational. Nonetheless, it comes from his knowledge, his deep knowledge and interest in art history, the experience of churches. I'm not religious either, but I've probably been to more Catholic churches than Catholics, because they're great storehouses for art. So you study art history, you have to study that, and as he did. And it's so interesting how he's again, we've talked about him, being a great observer and distilling things down. He did that with the kind of aspects of art history, specifically the Stations of the Cross, which these panels they come from this idea of 14 Stations of the Cross that represent, Christ's suffering in these specific ways.
There are 14
What you
of
would
these,
not know if you didn't know that, but if you do know that, you can relate it visually to that tradition where the cross itself becomes a protagonist in this story, and especially the use of verticals, diagonals, and horizontals. And so he basically got that and used that to create these panels. So it's just interesting to read, knowing that tradition. And of course, it's not a cross; it's a totem, but it is of wood. It is vertical, and it stands in the apse. So these things are all, they inform our understanding of the piece in a great way.
Absolutely. This is when Carter mentioned the totem, this is another totem. Our totem does not yet exist, but this is a redwood totem. And I even think the language of the totem, the fact that he calls them totems, speaks to your point about his relationship with art of the past, because you think of a totem and it's one of the earliest forms of art making. I mean, he's always getting back, you'll see some images of, I quickly scrolled through them, of sculptures that he calls stelae, going back to early, Egyptian traditions, and so really incredibly steeped in the past, and yet without any program, without any.
It's art as a meditative space. You're looking at art as a meditative kind of activity and practice, which is a wonderful thing. And one of the more obvious precedents is it's not an influence, but is Barnett Newman's great series of paintings, The Stations of the Cross, which are also similarly they're not. Specific. He takes that on as a springboard, but he wasn't responding specifically to that program. But more the idea of some kind of ritual or some kind of where you put yourself in your head, and it gets you into that kind of frame of mind.
And how do we? There are a number of you here from Houston, and we have the Rothko Chapel essentially down the street, not too far away from here. And I think it's interesting to think about how he's both responding to art of the past, but also there's a tradition of the sort of modern building designed by an artist. But there's a lot of, I think, important distinctions between this building and perhaps, the Rothko Chapel. And let me show you a few more images. This is him at his studio showing us the rose window from Chart that he was, really.
You really see the connection.
You can really see the connection there.
The focus on the tumbling squares.
Yeah, the tumbling squares and how much life and movement they have. Let me just show you one more. This is what I've been calling sort of the sunburst or the starburst. But I'd love to hear, any of your thoughts on how this work will differ in some ways. Maybe Richard, since I think you've been to all of these other precedents, but how it sort of differs from those traditions too.
Yeah, as you were all, you and Carter were talking about this, it was reminding me, nevertheless, regardless of the obvious connections to the barrel vault in Romanesque architecture and so on, we could also go back to his Guggenheim project and the primer, the book that he created, which is now in the Museum of Modern Art, and where he laid out all of these basic principles for teaching design and art. So you have the straight line, the horizontal, the vertical, the diagonal, you have black versus white, then you have the colors, and then you have, there are a couple of pages where things get combined. And that's what's happening in Austin. It's all being played out in both 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions in this project. It is, as you or somebody else said, I think you said it, the evidence of a lifetime of thinking about these basic relationships and making something of them. The relationships, he might say, Ellsworth might say, well, I didn't invent these things, that they're found. The colors of the rainbow or the spectrum, they're there. But look at what we can do with them. And the buildings of the various religious traditions, both pagan modern are examples of the use of these principles, and therefore meditation, contemplation, spirituality, or just observation.
Absolutely, and he's talked about it, his hopes for Austin and really envisioning it as a place for calm and meditation, all the words that I think you mentioned. Just going back for a moment to the Rothko Chapel and also to Matisse's Chapel in Vence, if you ever have a chance to go there, they are quite different though from this project. There's a German term that refers to like a complete work of art, Gesamtkunstwerk. It's like the only word I know in German. But you know, he's designed every facet of this building. He's designed the structure with the help of wonderful architects here. But he's also designed the structure. He's designed every panel. This is not going to be changing. This is not an exhibition space or a gallery space. The building is a work of art.
And it's an experience. He's designed the experience that you move. It's time-based and that you move around it, and that's important too. Yeah.
Right. Because if he's somebody who's thinking about early in his career the relationship between the painting and the wall, he's thinking about everything here, every single, like as you said, the experience of walking through space. And going back to the spectrums, this has been a sort of a lifelong quest for him, the sort of preoccupation with trying to, he keeps making these spectrum, he made this early one, I think this is while he's still in Paris perhaps, the spectrum from SF MoMA. This is not this slide I meant, but this is actually fantastic. This is from the studio where he's working out the color and thinking about the color with these small sheets of sort of
21st century gummed paper.
Yes, precisely. And he has an amazing team at his studio who rigged a garage door basically in one of the studios into, it's the place where we were constantly moving in panes of glass being sent to us from the studio in Munich, the world's leading sort of stained glass. Michael Meyer, he's working with us, and it's been wonderful. We've mostly done these meetings in the freezing cold in parkas in this garage looking at the panes of glass.
So there were specific different colors that he was choosing from for each color. There were different shades and tonal values that were shifting, and then he chose one of them?
Well, he's been guiding the whole process, but I think it's, for him, I can only imagine, I'm not going to put words into his mouth, but he has said, for him as somebody who's been thinking about color his whole life, to suddenly render it in glass with light coming through is just like, it's kind of mind-blowing.
You had at the beginning the image of the Munsell colors.
Color charts.
And when he was a student, he went beyond the assignment and tried to find the colors that it's really the source of the colors that he chooses for his spectrum paintings, I think. Tried to find the colors that were the most saturated, but at the same time could be arranged in a sequence without appearing to change the tonal value, the dark light quality. And it's basically impossible to do. So when he was explaining this, he said, well, I had to cheat a little bit with the darker colors and get a very strange violet to use instead of a super saturated violet. But, there he was at that point, he was young. He was like 17 or something. I don't know, something like that?
Yeah, he was.
And it's a lifelong quest. And now it's taken another dimension, as you say, in glass.
And he wasn't happy with that French 1953 spectrum. He didn't feel that it was, for him, even though we love it, it wasn't fully resolved. So that's why he kind of just shunted aside, then came back to the States and painted all his more curvilinear, voluptuous paintings like the Atlantic. And then he got reinvigorated by the multi-panel in the mid-'60s. So he kind of put it aside for a while. He'd made a few here and there. But artists often, sometimes they have different projects. And so he returned to the multi-panel in the mid-'60s. And that's when he started back and made his first spectrum again in 66, if I'm correct, 65 or 66. And then that's when he started to separate. And he could resolve that saturation problem and the gradation by separating the colors. And so that's when he started creating the interstitial spaces along the wall and then really emphasizing the wall in a new way. And the wall, the white becomes part of the work as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. I love this idea, though, of him trying to give the same weight to each color, which is sort of an impossible task in the spectrum. But what artist doesn't put themselves up to the impossible task? A good artist, anyway.
The good ones do.
Very good ones do. And on that note, I do want to leave some time for questions. So thank you guys so much for this really wonderful and illuminating panel.